Back in my childhood and running into, I would say, my early to mid-20s, I was very interested in war games of all sorts and the sort of spectrum that led into role-playing games with all sorts of cool stuff in the middle. And I was thinking about this in part because a colleague of mine recently on Twitter, I guess he was digging around in his stuff and he found some old Steve Jackson games, specifically those having to do with the tank battles of the future called Ogre and Jav and other things like that. And then the Illuminati games that Steve Jackson had produced as well, and people brought up another great Steve Jackson game called Car Wars, and it brought back all these interesting old memories of stuff that I haven't really done anything with for really decades. And so, the story begins, as far as I can remember. I mean, you could say that it begins before it really begins with those kinds of things. Playing chess with my dad and with my grandpa. I mean, chess is one of the classic war games. It's very formalistic and stuff like that. And I'm not sure where I found this advertisement for a game that was from the Yaquinto Game Company, simply called Battle. And I remember reading about it and being like, that sounds pretty cool. And I sent away, $6 to get it, and it came to my place. And I played it with my dad a few times, who I think he wasn't that into those sorts of things, but he thought, well, this will be a great thing for me and my son to do together. And we would play these very generic games, hexagonal things that had, like, you could do Napoleonic Wars or Modern Warfare. There were a lot of different variations. And I was kind of learning about how war games worked. War games, not chess, but war games with the hexes and die-cut counters and that sort of thing. And Yaquinto was a sort of new entry to the game world. There was also Avalon Hill, which had put out a number of games by that time. And this drew me into an entire world, you could say, right? And so I started getting interested in more and more complex war games. The challenge was always to find people who would play them with you, because I didn't live in a city. I lived out in the countryside near the village of Wales, and there weren't a lot of other kids who were particularly interested in doing that kind of stuff. We played board games like Sorry and Parcheesi, and we had that vibrating thing with the football players. When I say we, I mean one of my friends did, where the football players would bump into each other and you'd have plays and stuff like that. And then, of course, there were handheld, sports games that were becoming popular as well, with the really, nowadays, terrible LED lights and very rudimentary programming. But I was interested in these imaginary games. And again, I'm not sure what magazines I was getting that had stuff like this in it. It might have been like in Boy's Life or something like that way back then. But that first war game kind of got me hooked. And then, I wanted to play more and more of these things. And then a little bit later, and it would have been, I think, the Christmas of 1980, or 1981, my parents, I guess it was in part because I was into fantasy literature and sci-fi stuff, they got me Dungeons and Dragons, the beginner's set. And I remember actually being fascinated with that and bringing it along to Christmas Mass and reading through the rule book while I'm supposed to be paying attention to what's going on in church. And, my parents were happy because I was being quiet. And it was really cool, and I started, thinking, this is really interesting stuff. And, I want to say it probably was 1980, because I would have been in 6th grade, because there were some other kids that I met who were into that sort of stuff. My friend Steve, my friend John, who went to my school, my friend Keith, who I'd gone to elementary school with. And, we would try to do this role-playing stuff. And then I realized that there were other, extensions to this. So the Dungeons and Dragons, you had the beginners thing, you had the advanced. And as it turned out, my Uncle John had some of the even earlier Dungeons and Dragons stuff, because his brother-in-law, Bill, these were down in Chicago, was into this sort of thing. So I had him to chat with, and they actually gave me some of their old rule books. And the funny thing was, I'm trying to make sense of all of this and wrap my head around it, and the stuff doesn't actually map onto each other quite so coherently. Anyway, long story short, I get into war games a bit more. My dad, unfortunately, passes away in August of 1982. Otherwise, I think he would have been quite interested in these things with me as well. And in a way, doing this kind of stuff, the fantasy, role-playing and the wargaming and the other things that I was getting into, was an escape from the not really dealing with grief very well and all that kind of stuff. And then, I'd find people who were into gaming in general. And so it went in a couple different directions. Like, for example, my friend John, he had a younger brother, Mark, and they were into the Steve Jackson game stuff with Car Wars and Ogre to a certain degree, which was this futuristic tank games. Car Wars is sort of like a Mad Max. You put guns on your cars, and everybody's driving between cities, and it's kind of post-apocalyptic. And we had lots and lots of fun, and all of these things were just kind of like being churned out. And I remember being allowed to play some D&D with some of my friends in middle school, like during break times. And of course we get made fun of, oh, you bunch of nerds and stuff like that. But we were really into it. We could never get things working all the way through. Like, we never really made it through an entire module. So there was the role-playing aspect, and then that led me into other role-playing games along with other people who I knew. So, I bought Gamma World, which was another TSR. TSR did the Dungeons and Dragons, and Gamma World was somewhat compatible with it. That was a post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear apocalypse game as well. And what else did I got my hands on Paranoia at one time. Never actually got to play it, unfortunately. And on the other hand, I was doing the other, tabletop war games. We had a neighbor who kind of wanted to be my surrogate dad, Bill Maris, and he had a whole bunch of these games, and he would lend them to me, some of which I kept forever. Sometimes I'd lose some of the counters and stuff too. And sometimes he and I would play these games together, and that was a lot of fun. Stay up late, match wits in Blitzkrieg, or there was a Frederick the Great, the 7 Years' War. There was a game called War and Peace that he lent me that was the entire Napoleonic Wars that I played on a massive coffee table. Just as a side note, sometimes I'd get these things set up and then my dog would come in the room, and she was a Black Lab German Shepherd mix, and so she had a big long bushy tail, and she'd walk by and she'd her tail would sweep all these things off. There was a World War II game called Third Reich that I would play as well, and oftentimes I played these games where I would take each side and I would play against myself. And so, this sort of thing continued on. there was Bill Maris. There was playing these games with the two brothers, and sometimes with some other friends. And then I had a friend from middle school who I started hanging out with in freshman and sophomore year, and he and I went to Gen Con together. And Gen Con, if you don't know, is like the big gamers mecca. And it used to be here in Milwaukee, in Mecca. And so my mom drove us out. And he and I went in halvesies on a whole bunch of miniature figurines, which then we had to paint and stuff like that. And we got some rules for wargaming, and we would play in his place, and we would have these massive battles. We also got into the Avalon Hill. It wasn't Squad Leader, which I had later. It was the Panzer things, which had to do with tank battles. And, you could make these massive maps and have these giant battles between the German and the Russian forces, or German and British forces, or you could actually make the Brits fight the Russians if you wanted to, right? So I was getting into this pretty heavy and doing different things with different people. And then, what ended up happening, I would say, is I ended up not wanting to go over to the two brothers' place because their parents were really, and now I recognize that they were hoarders, and I kind of didn't like the scene. And so I was doing less and less with them. Me and one of the other guys, Steve, we started doing stuff that had more to do with playing chess and watching movies and making popcorn and drinking, soda and listening to music together and stuff like that. George and I kind of split ways as well, I think in part because I was really a mess in high school and he was kind of going places, and so he started getting into rock climbing and I wasn't into that. But I did have other friends that I would play Axis and Allies with, and that was quite a bit of fun with Marshall and some of Ed and some of these other people. And I continued playing some of the other games, and then I finished high school and went off and was in the Army. And interestingly, while I was in the Army, I actually played a lot of D&D because, weirdly enough, in the unit that I was in, there were a lot of guys who were into that. And it was okay. There were a lot of people who were what we call rules lawyers, where they're always trying to argue about stuff, or they were trying to maximize their stats, or they're playing. I think there were a lot of guys who were indulging their feminine side because they'd roll themselves up some female half elf, and then basically she would sleep with the other non-player characters and stuff like that. But it was kind of fun. And then I get out of the Army, and I knew this guy, Bill, who lived in Wauwatosa, which is, that's in the Milwaukee area. And he and his friends, all these 20-somethings, they were into role-playing games as well. In particular, Twilight 2000, which then, as somebody who'd been in the military, I was sort of a natural for that. So he would come out and pick me up in Waukesha, which we were living in by then. We'd moved from Wales to Waukesha. And I'd come out and hang out with him and his brother and all these other friends, and we'd play Twilight 2000 and occasionally other games as well. So, there were a lot of people to do interesting things with. Then I went up to college, and there were some people who were into gaming up there as well, and we played Twilight 2000. We actually adapted it to some sort of zombie scenario, and I made up a whole bunch of stuff. I was GMing by then. And there were some other people who were into doing the board games as well. I got to play Squad Leader with a few people, and that continued on. It was always something that was kind of a fun side thing to do, and I'll say I never really got to got to engage in these things to their full potential. Campaigns would start and then they would end halfway through the campaign because people would get too busy, or somebody would get a girlfriend, or I would get a girlfriend. And then, or I would get more into playing cards in the party room or something like that. I did a lot of partying back in college. I also played soccer for a while too. Helped train people on the soccer team. So I was a pretty busy guy, but it was a fun part of my existence that never really went that far as perhaps I would have liked. I don't know if I'll ever get back into the hobby again. Dungeons and Dragons is now on like 5th edition. I started out with 1st edition, so I have no clue what's going on with that. And there's probably other interesting role-playing games that I could get involved in, or tabletop things. I mean, now it's basically Catan with my wife and kids occasionally, or, we have some plans to do it with other couples, but it's never actually panned out. And that's fun too, there's maybe part of your brain that likes all of this, board gaming, role playing, all the things in between. I used to spend hours and hours, painting these miniature figures that we would use for stuff. And I think about all the many, if you added them up, they're probably months or years that I spent on all of this stuff. And you can say, well, what a waste. You're a philosopher now. You could have been using that time to read books or something. But I don't think it was a waste. I think it was an important part of my childhood and adolescence and early adulthood. And I don't know if I'll ever get really back into it again. I don't know if I have the time to, but it was a lot of fun. And so I think that's pretty cool. So maybe that's where there's one other thing I'll tell you about before I end the story. So there's a book out there that's hard to get your hands on, although there is a PDF floating around on the internet. And it's called Fantasy Wargaming. And you got to remember that in the 1980s, all these different companies, all these different people were putting out game systems, some of which were quite successful. Think about Dungeons and Dragons, some of which were pretty cool, but never lived up to their full potential and didn't get the traction that they wanted. Some of which tried to do a little bit of everything. You think about GURPS, the generic universal role-playing game, which I also did with Bill and his brother and some of these other people now that I recall. And this fantasy wargaming was an attempt to try to make it very historical. It was in one book. Never got to play it with anybody, but the rule system to me looked pretty cool. And I would spend hours reading through this book. I even remember taking it on spring break. It got very little love from other gamers. As a matter of fact, if you go online and look it up, people say it's one of the worst systems ever developed, But I actually thought it was pretty cool. And I think that, there's probably a lot of other things out there like that where, some people will criticize it, but others will say, there's something kind of neat here. And so, I haven't thought about these things for quite a long time, but I was spurred to, again, by my colleague posting the Steve Jackson games that I got to play to some degree, but not as much as I would have liked. And I think it's kind of cool that nowadays, if you're into that sort of stuff, it's become part of pop culture. Think about Stranger Things, right? Or other things where the nerds are no longer, treated quite so badly by the cool kids and stuff like that. So that's kind of a meandering story about war games, role-playing games, miniature figures, all of that sort of business. Not quite sure what rubric to associate all this under, but there's my story for you.